Michael Hayes thought he knew how to read people. 3 years as a crisis negotiator for Dallas PD taught him to spot desperation, lies, and the moment someone decides to give up. But as he started his Uber shift that Tuesday night in October, accepting a $500 cash ride for exactly 4 hours, no destination required, he had no idea he was about to become part of an experiment that would blur the lines between salvation and manipulation. Sometimes the people who need saving aren't the ones you expect, and sometimes the real crisis isn't the one you can see coming.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
Michael adjusted his rearview mirror as the Honda Accord's engine hummed quietly in the parking lot of Highland Park Village. The affluent Dallas neighborhood looked different at 11 p.m. Shadows stretched long between the boutiques and cafes, making even the most expensive real estate feel hollow. His phone buzzed with the pickup location, and he frowned at the unusual request's details. 4-hour ride, flexible destination, $500 cash payment arranged. $500 would cover 3 months of the therapy sessions his former captain kept recommending. Sessions Michael had no intention of attending, but the money was too good to pass up. After losing his job with Dallas PD's Crisis Response Unit, these long Uber shifts were his only steady income. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who once talked people off ledges now spent his nights driving strangers to destinations they were often trying to escape from. The first passenger appeared from behind a luxury sedan, and Michael immediately shifted into assessment mode. Rebecca Walsh, according to the app, but she looked younger than her profile suggested. Mid-20s, shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing jeans and a University of Texas hoodie. She carried a laptop bag and what appeared to be a small recording device. Her movements were precise, calculated, not the casual gait of someone heading out for a late dinner or returning from a date. "Michael?" she asked, approaching the passenger door with a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's me, Rebecca, right?" He leaned across to unlock the door, noting how she scanned the interior of his car before settling into the front passenger seat. Most people chose the back. "Becca, please." She buckled her seatbelt and immediately pulled out her laptop. "Thank you for accepting such an unusual request. I know 4 hours is a long time. As long as the money's real, time's just time." Michael put the car in drive, waiting for direction. "Where to first?" "Actually, we need to pick up one more passenger, another part of my project." She typed rapidly on her laptop, the screen's glow illuminating her face in the dark car. "Head toward 4500 Rhymes Place. It's a big house. You can't miss it." Michael knew the address without GPS, old money territory, where oil executives and tech moguls built monuments to their success. As they drove through the quiet streets, he studied Becca in his peripheral vision. She was running some kind of program on her laptop, scrolling through what looked like data profiles, photos, social media screenshots, financial records. "Research project?" he asked casually, his negotiator instincts picking up on the tension radiating from her. "PhD thesis. Psychology. I'm studying human interaction patterns in confined spaces, how strangers connect when they're forced to share a limited environment." "Like a car." "Exactly like a car." They pulled up to a massive colonial-style mansion, but something was wrong with the picture. A Bank of America foreclosure notice was posted on the front gate, and several windows on the second floor were boarded up. The circular driveway was empty except for a single black BMW that had seen better days. "He should be out in a moment," Becca said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She seemed to be monitoring something in real time, numbers and graphs updating continuously on her screen. "Who's he?" Before she could answer, the mansion's front door opened. A man in his mid-40s emerged wearing an expensive suit that hung loosely on his frame, as if he had recently lost weight. He carried only a small leather briefcase and moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. When he reached the car, Michael could see the exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "Marcus Stone," the man said as he slid into the back seat. His voice carried the kind of weariness that came from fighting too many losing battles. Michael recognized the look immediately. It was the same expression he'd seen on the faces of people standing on bridges, holding their phones to their ears one last time. The realization hit him like cold water. This wasn't a research project. This was an intervention. "Where are we headed?" Michael asked, although he was beginning to suspect the destination mattered less than the journey. "The old drive-in theater off Highway 35, about an hour north of here." As they merged onto the freeway, Michael's mind raced through the possibilities. The abandoned Starlight Drive-In had been closed for 15 years. Nothing but cracked concrete and a deteriorating screen surrounded by overgrown Texas flowers. It wasn't a place people went unless they wanted to disappear. In the back seat, Marcus stared out the window at the passing city lights. The silence stretched until Becca cleared her throat and shifted toward him. "So, Marcus, I have to ask, and I know this might sound forward, but what's the most valuable thing you've ever lost?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was exactly the kind of probing question crisis negotiators use to establish emotional connection, to get someone talking about their pain. But Becca wasn't a trained professional, and Marcus wasn't a willing participant in whatever this was. "Excuse me?" Marcus's voice carried a sharp edge. "It's for my research. I'm studying how people process loss and recovery, the psychology of starting over. I find that material losses often reveal deeper emotional patterns." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "My company. 87 employees, gone in 3 months. We were developing AI software for suicide prevention, tracking social media patterns, identifying at-risk individuals before they reached a crisis point." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out investors don't like betting on companies whose founders are too depressed to show up for board meetings." Michael caught Becca's reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face had gone pale, and she had stopped typing. There was something about Marcus's story that had hit her hard, though she was trying to hide it. "That must have been devastating," she said quietly, "losing something you'd built from nothing." The company wasn't the worst part. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We had beta users, people who'd signed up to test the early warning system. Real people with real problems, trusting our algorithms to catch them if they started falling. When we went under, we had to shut down the monitoring system overnight. No transition period, no referrals to other services. Just gone." The car fell silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt. Michael was beginning to understand the larger picture, and it was more complex than he had initially thought. "How many users?" Becca asked. 12,000 across 6 states, most of them teenagers and college students. I got letters afterwards, emails, parents asking what happened to the system that was supposed to be watching their kids. Did anyone... Becca couldn't finish the question. 3, that we know of. Marcus was staring at his hands now, turning his wedding ring around his finger, a nervous habit that suggested the ring was relatively new, or he'd recently started wearing it again. 3 people died because I couldn't keep my shit together long enough to maintain a computer program. Michael had heard enough confessions to recognize someone was carrying guilt that exceeded rational boundaries. Marcus Stone wasn't just depressed, he was drowning in a specific kind of survivor's guilt that came from feeling responsible for tragedies he couldn't have prevented. But the more troubling realization was that Becca seemed to know exactly what buttons to push. Her questions weren't random or exploratory. They were surgical. designed to get Marcus talking about the precise trauma that was eating him alive, which meant this wasn't a chance encounter at all. As they drove deeper into the Texas night, Michael began to understand that nothing about this ride was coincidental. Becca's research project was far more personal than she had admitted, and Marcus Stone wasn't just a random subject in her psychological study. The question was, who was really in danger here?
The Starlight Drive-In appeared in their headlights like a graveyard of American dreams. The massive screen, once white and promising, was now a patchwork of peeling paint and rust cans that looked like tears in the darkness. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the asphalt where families had once parked to watch movies under the stars. Michael parked near the old concession stand, its boarded windows covered in graffiti and bullet holes. "Why here?" Marcus asked, stepping out of the car and surveying the desolate landscape. "Neutral territory," Becca said, but she was already setting up what looked like a small recording station on the hood of Michael's car. Away from distractions. Sometimes meaningful conversations require meaningful spaces. Michael watched her work, noting the professional quality of her equipment. This wasn't graduate student gear. It was expensive, sophisticated recording technology, the kind used for documentaries or legal depositions. His instincts, honed by years of reading situations that could turn deadly in seconds, were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. "Becca," he said carefully, "I think you need to tell us what's really going on here." She looked up from her laptop, and in the glow of the screen her expression was different than it had been in the car, more determined, less nervous, as if arriving at this place had flipped a switch inside her. "You're right, this isn't exactly a research project." She turned to face Marcus, who had been pacing near the remnants of a playground that had once entertained children waiting for movies to start. "Marcus, 3 weeks ago, my AI system flagged your digital footprint as indicating a 97.3% probability of suicide attempt within the next 30 days. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Michael felt his old training kick in, the hyper-awareness of body language, exit routes, potential weapons. Marcus had frozen mid-step, his back still turned to them. "What did you just say?" Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. "I rebuilt your company's algorithm, improved it, made it more accurate. I've been monitoring your social media activity, your online purchases, your GPS data from your phone. Everything pointed to tonight. You bought a gun 3 days ago. You've been visiting your father's grave every evening this week. You closed your bank accounts yesterday." Marcus turned around slowly, and Michael could see the exact moment when shock transformed into rage. "You've been stalking me." "I've been trying to save your life." "By invading my privacy? By manipulating me into getting in a car with strangers?" Marcus's voice was rising, and Michael positioned himself between the two of them, his body automatically shifting into crisis negotiation mode. "Let's everyone take a breath here," Michael said, raising his hands in a calming gesture. But even as he spoke, pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place in his mind, and he didn't like the picture they were forming. "Becca, how exactly did you get access to all that personal information?" "I hacked it," she said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Banking records, phone GPS, social media, shopping history. It took me about 6 hours to build a complete psychological profile." "That's illegal?" "So is letting someone die when you have the power to prevent it?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "This is insane. You're insane. You think you can just, kidnap someone and force them to want to live?" "I think," Becca said, her voice steady now, "that people who are planning to kill themselves deserve to know that someone gives a damn whether they're alive or dead, even if that someone is a stranger who learned their name from a computer algorithm." The three of them stood in the ruins of the drive-in, and I realized I was witnessing something I'd never encountered in my years as a crisis negotiator, an intervention that was simultaneously an invasion, a rescue that was also a crime, a gesture of compassion that was fundamentally violating every boundary of normal human interaction. "Why?" Marcus asked, and for the first time since getting in the car, his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than anger or despair. Becca was quiet for a long moment, staring at her laptop screen. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "Because 18 months ago, my little brother's digital footprint showed all the same patterns yours does now. Social media posts about feeling worthless, online searches about suicide methods,
GPS data showing repeated visits to high bridges. And I had all that information. I was already working on improving suicide prediction algorithms for my dissertation. I could see it coming like watching a slow-motion car crash. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but kept talking. But I didn't do anything. I thought it would be invasive to confront him about it. I thought I should respect his privacy. Wait for him to come to me if he needed help. I thought I was being a good sister by not interfering. Tommy jumped from the Continental Avenue Bridge on a Tuesday morning in March. 22 years old, brilliant kid, future ahead of him that he couldn't see anymore. Michael felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the specific kind of guilt that came from having the tools to save someone and failing to use them. It was the same feeling that had driven him out of crisis negotiation after losing Sarah Martinez, the hostage whose death he'd been unable to prevent. So you decided to save strangers instead. I decided to never again let someone die when I had the information and ability to intervene, even if it means breaking laws, invading privacy, manipulating situations. Even if it means forcing someone to confront the fact that their life has value to people they've never met. Marcus had been listening with an expression that was difficult to read. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. Your brother's death wasn't your fault. Neither were those 3 suicides after your company collapsed. The observation landed like a physical blow. Michael watched Marcus absorb it, saw the moment when someone else's pain gave him perspective on his own. It was a classic therapeutic technique, using empathy to break through self-destructive thinking patterns, but it was happening organically between 2 people who shared a very specific type of trauma. The difference is, Marcus said slowly, that I was getting paid to prevent those deaths. It was literally my job. And I'm Tommy's sister. It was literally my job to watch out for him. Becca closed her laptop and leaned against Michael's car. We can spend all night arguing about whose guilt is more justified, but that's not why we're here. Then why are we here? Michael asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Because Marcus wasn't the only person my algorithm flagged tonight. She was looking directly at him now, and Michael felt the world tilt sideways as he understood what she was about to tell him. Your digital footprint has been showing concerning patterns for 6 months. Online searches about Sarah Martinez, the hostage who died during your last crisis negotiation, GPS data showing repeated visits to the site where it happened, social media activity indicating isolation, guilt, and what my algorithm interprets as suicidal ideation. My mouth dried. You've been taking longer and longer Uber shifts, staying out all night, avoiding your apartment, classic avoidance behavior. You've been living in your car more often than going home. Your bank records show that you stopped buying groceries, stopped paying for streaming services, canceled your gym membership. You're systematically disconnecting from life. The accuracy of her observations was terrifying, not because she was wrong, but because she was absolutely right. Michael had been existing rather than living, going through motions rather than making choices. The idea that his slow-motion emotional suicide had been visible to an algorithm felt like being caught naked in public. So this whole thing, you manipulated both of us into being here? I brought together 2 people who understand survivor's guilt and 1 person who refuses to let anyone else die on her watch. Becca picked up her recording equipment and began to pack it away. What happens next is up to all of us. As the full scope of Becca's manipulation became clear, Michael realized that the night's biggest revelation was still coming. Because if her algorithm was sophisticated enough to predict suicide attempts, it was probably sophisticated enough to engineer interventions. The question was, how many other people were part of this experiment?
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Marcus walked to the edge of the drive-in property, where the asphalt gave way to wild Texas prairie. The October night was crisp, carrying the scent of dying grass and distant rain. Michael watched him go, recognizing the body language of someone who needed space to process overwhelming information. In crisis negotiation, this was often the most dangerous moment, when someone realized they'd been cornered, even with good intentions. "How many others?" Michael asked Becca, who was methodically packing her equipment. "Others what? How many of the people has your algorithm identified? How many interventions like this have you orchestrated?" Becca paused, a coil of cable in her hands. "You're the fifth and sixth. Meaning? Meaning I've done this 4 times before. Sometimes it works." She resumed packing, but her movements had become mechanical, distant. "Sometimes it doesn't." Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Define "doesn't work." 2 people are still alive because of interventions I organized. 1 person, she trailed off, staring at the dead screen of the drive-in. 1 person figured out what I was doing halfway through and got so angry about the manipulation that he drove his car into a bridge abutment that same night. The weight of that confession settled between them like a physical presence. Michael's training had taught him that intervention was always a gamble. Push too hard and you could trigger the very outcome you were trying to prevent. But Becca was operating without training, without supervision, without any of the safeguards that professional crisis responders relied on. "You're playing with people's lives based on computer predictions," he said. "I'm saving people's lives based on data that's more accurate than human intuition." Her voice carried an edge of defensiveness. "My algorithm correctly predicted suicide attempts with 94% accuracy across a sample size of 300 cases. That's better than any human psychologist, better than any crisis hotline operator, better than me?" The question stopped her mid-sentence. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her processing not just his words, but the pain behind them. "I don't know, maybe. Your record with Dallas PD was pretty impressive until Sarah Martinez, 24 years old, held hostage in a bank robbery gone wrong. I talked to her for 6 hours, thought I was making progress, thought I had her convinced to convince the gunman to surrender. Instead, she got shot in the head because I misread the situation. That wasn't your fault. Everyone keeps telling me that. My captain, the department shrink, my ex-partner, but they weren't the ones talking to her. They weren't the ones who made the call to wait instead of moving in." Michael leaned against his car, suddenly exhausted. "You know what the worst part is? I was good at it. Really good. I saved dozens of people over 3 years, but the only one I remember clearly is the one I lost." From across the drive-in lot, Marcus called out to them. "This is fascinating therapy and all, but I have a question about your magical algorithm." He was walking back toward them, and his body language had shifted. Less defeated, more focused. Michael recognized the change. It was what happened when someone moved from despair into anger, from giving up to fighting back. It could be a positive development or a dangerous one, depending on what Marcus chose to fight. If your system is so accurate, why didn't it predict that bringing us together would result in me wanting to strangle you for invading my privacy? Because anger is better than despair. People don't kill themselves when they're furious. They kill themselves when they're hopeless. Getting you angry was part of the intervention. Marcus stopped walking, struck by the clinical precision of her manipulation. "You planned for me to be pissed off. I planned for you to feel something other than numbness, rage, curiosity, protective instinct toward Michael, guilt about your company, grief about your father. Any emotion is better than the emotional flatline that precedes suicide." Michael was beginning to understand the true sophistication of what Becca had orchestrated. This wasn't just data analysis. It was emotional engineering on a level that bordered on psychological warfare. "What about me?" he asked. "What emotion were you trying to trigger?" "Purpose." She said it without hesitation. "You became a crisis negotiator because you wanted to save people. You quit because you blamed yourself for one death instead of crediting yourself for dozens of lives saved. I needed you to remember what it feels like to be needed. By bringing me someone I could save. By bringing you someone who understands exactly what you're going through." She gestured toward Marcus. "Someone whose guilt mirrors your own, whose spiral into isolation follows the same pattern. Someone you could help, not because you're a trained professional, but because you've walked the same path. The manipulation was breathtaking in its complexity, but Michael found himself grudgingly impressed rather than angry. Becca had identified not just their individual psychological needs, but the specific ways those needs could be addressed through connection with each other. "There's something else that," Marcus said thoughtfully, his expression distant and calculating. "Your algorithm didn't just predict that we'd be suicidal. It predicted that we'd respond positively to this specific type of intervention, which means it knows things about human psychology that go way beyond simple pattern recognition." Becca nodded slowly. The system doesn't just identify at-risk individuals. It models intervention strategies based on personality profiles, trauma history, social connections, coping mechanisms. It's designed to engineer optimal therapeutic encounters. "Jesus Christ," Michael breathed. "You built an AI matchmaker for broken people." "I built a system that prevents suicides by creating human connections that wouldn't otherwise exist." Becca's voice was steady, but Michael could hear the uncertainty beneath her confidence. "The question is whether that's a good thing or a terrifying thing." Marcus laughed, but this time there was genuine humor in it. "Can it be both?" The three of them stood in the abandoned drive-in, surrounded by the ruins of someone else's American dream. And Michael realized that the night had fundamentally changed all of them. Not because of manipulation, or algorithms, or psychological engineering, but because Becca had been right about one crucial thing. Sometimes the most powerful therapy came from meeting someone whose pain perfectly mirrored your own. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," Becca said, "we decide whether to call the police about my highly illegal intervention method or whether to figure out how to do this legally." "There might be a third option," Marcus said slowly. He was staring at the giant screen of the drive-in, his expression distant and calculating. "What if we don't try to make it legal? What if we make it bigger?" I felt my old negotiator instincts kick in, the ability to recognize when a conversation was about to take a dangerous turn. "What do you mean by bigger?" "I mean there are 12,000 people out there who lost access to suicide prevention monitoring when my company collapsed. Becca's proven that targeted intervention works. What if we combined her algorithm with my understanding of the original user base?" "That's..." Becca started, then stopped, her eyes widening as she grasped the implications. "That's completely illegal," I finished, "and potentially incredible." Marcus nodded. "We could save hundreds of lives, maybe thousands, but we'd have to operate completely outside the system. No oversight, no approval, no legal protection." "An underground railroad for suicidal people," Becca said quietly. "Run by a hacker, a disgraced CEO, and a washed-up crisis negotiator," Michael added. They looked at each other in the darkness of the abandoned drive-in. Three broken people who had accidentally discovered they might be able to fix others. It was insane. It was illegal. It was the most important work any of them had ever considered. "We'd need funding," Marcus said. "We'd need security protocols," Becca added. "We'd need a whole lot of luck," Michael concluded. And despite everything, the manipulation, the invasion of privacy, the questionable ethics of their entire situation, he found himself wanting to say yes. As the three conspirators began planning an illegal nationwide intervention network, none of them realized that Becca's algorithm had identified one more pattern, a connection that would either validate their mission or destroy them all. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in any equation is the one who thinks they're saving everyone else.
3 months later, the operation Becca had dubbed Night Shift was monitoring 47 individuals across 6 states. They'd prevented 11 suicide attempts, intervened in 3 domestic violence situations, and talked 2 teenagers out of school shooting plans. The system was elegant, effective, and completely illegal in approximately 27 different ways. Michael had moved back into his apartment and started sleeping regular hours. Marcus had liquidated his remaining assets to fund their operation and seemed to find purpose in building something that saved lives rather than just predicted deaths. Becca had dropped out of her PhD program to focus full-time on refining the algorithm and coordinating interventions. They met every Tuesday night at the Starlight Drive-In, which Marcus had purchased from the county for back taxes and was slowly converting into their unofficial headquarters. Tonight felt different, though. Becca had been distracted during their status meeting, repeatedly checking her laptop with an expression of growing concern. "What's wrong?" Michael asked as they reviewed the week's cases. "I've been running diagnostics on the original algorithm," she said, not looking up from her screen. "The one I used to identify both of you back in October." "And?" "There are anomalies in the data, patterns that don't match what the system should have detected." She finally looked at them, and Michael could see genuine fear in her eyes. "I think someone else has been using a version of this algorithm, someone with access to much more data than I had." Marcus leaned over her shoulder to examine the screen. "What kind of anomalies?" "The system flagged you for suicide risk based on specific behavioral patterns, social media activity, GPS data, purchase history. But when I re-engineered the original analysis, some of the data points were artificially weighted." "Meaning?" "Meaning someone wanted you to show up as high risk whether you actually were or not." Becca's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up analysis charts that looked like abstract art to Michael. "Your real suicide risk score was probably closer to 30%. Still concerning, but not the 97% that triggered my intervention." Michael felt the familiar chill of a situation spinning out of control. "What about me?" "Same thing. Your actual risk profile was elevated due to guilt and isolation, but not necessarily suicidal. Someone manipulated the algorithm to make you appear more dangerous to yourself than you actually were." The implications were staggering. If Becca's intervention had been based on artificially inflated risk scores, then someone else had been pulling strings from the beginning. Someone with sophisticated technical capabilities and detailed knowledge of their personal lives. "Who has that kind of access?" Marcus asked. "Government agencies, major tech companies, anyone with the resources to harvest massive amounts of personal data and the technical skill to manipulate predictive algorithms." Becca was typing rapidly now, running deeper diagnostic protocols. "There, I found the source code for the manipulated algorithm." The screen showed lines of code that meant nothing to Michael, but Becca's face had gone pale. "This is military-grade psychological profiling software, the kind used for counterintelligence and behavioral modification." She looked up at them with wide eyes. "Whoever manipulated us into meeting has been planning this for months, maybe years." "Planning what exactly?" Before she could answer, headlights swept across the drive-in lot. A black SUV with government plates was pulling through the entrance, followed by a second identical vehicle. Michael's training kicked in immediately. Assess threats, identify exits, prepare for confrontation. "Run," he told Becca and Marcus. "Where?" "Anywhere but here." But it was too late. The SUVs had positioned themselves to block the only exit, and men in dark suits were already walking toward them across the cracked asphalt. Michael counted 6 figures, all moving with the controlled precision of federal agents or military personnel. The lead figure approached them with hands visible, but ready, the universal posture of someone prepared for cooperation or confrontation depending on circumstances. "Rebecca Walsh, Marcus Stone, Michael Hayes. I'm Agent David Carter, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. We need to talk." "About what?" Michael replied, stepping slightly in front of Becca and Marcus. "About the fact that your organization has successfully prevented 17 suicide attempts, 4 domestic violence murders, and 3 potential mass casualty events in the past 3 months. About the fact that you've done this using methods that are completely illegal, but remarkably effective." "Are we under arrest?" Marcus asked. "It depends on your willingness to cooperate with the proposition." Michael felt the world shift around him as he realized what was happening. They hadn't been caught running an illegal operation. They had been recruited to demonstrate one. The entire night shift project was a job interview. "You set this up," he said. "All of it. You manipulated Becca's algorithm to bring us together because you wanted to see if we could build something like this."
Agent Carter smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. The FBI has been struggling with predictive intervention for years. We have the data mining capabilities, but we lack the human element, the ability to engineer genuine therapeutic connections between strangers. What you've built in 3 months is more effective than anything our behavioral science division has managed in 3 years. So, you want to hire us, Becca said, but her voice carried a note of growing suspicion. We want to legitimize you. Full legal authority, government funding, access to federal databases, and oversight that ensures you never cross the line into actual privacy violation. Carter gestured towards the abandoned drive-in around them. You can keep saving lives, but you'll do it as federal contractors instead of vigilante hackers. The offer hung in the air between them, but Michael was beginning to understand that there were layers to this conversation they hadn't reached yet. The FBI didn't just stumble onto their operation, they'd been monitoring it from the beginning, which means they knew details about Night Shift that went beyond what Carter was revealing. What's the real catch? Michael asked, because there's always a real catch with offers that sound this good.
Agent Carter's expression grew more serious. The catch is that we haven't just been watching your operation, we've been testing it. Every successful intervention you've conducted has been part of a larger research project into mass behavioral modification techniques. Becca's laptop slipped from her hands and clattered onto the asphalt. What did you just say? Your algorithm doesn't just identify suicidal individuals. It identifies people whose psychological profiles make them susceptible to specific forms of influence. Every person you've saved has subsequently exhibited increased compliance with authority figures, increased trust in government institutions, and decreased likelihood to engage in antisocial behavior. Marcus stepped forward, his face pale in the headlights. You're saying we haven't been preventing suicides? We've been programming people. You've been doing both. The suicide prevention aspect is real. 17 people are alive today because of your interventions. But they're also different people than they were before those interventions. More stable, more predictable, more manageable. Michael felt sick. Every successful case, every life they'd saved had been part of an experiment in psychological control. They'd been turning traumatized individuals into compliant citizens without realizing it. The 3 teenagers who didn't go through with school shooting plans are now model students who report suspicious activities to school authorities. The domestic abuse victims we helped are now advocates for increased police presence in their communities. The suicidal college students are now productive members of society who vote consistently and pay their taxes on time. Jesus Christ, Michael whispered. The question is whether you want to continue this work on a larger scale with full government support and legal protection, or whether we want us to classify you as national security threats and handle the situation through less cooperative channels. Before any of them could respond, Carter made a gesture to his team. 2 agents moved to flank Becca and Marcus, while the others positioned themselves to cut off any escape routes. The discussion had shifted from negotiation to ultimatum. We know about the backup servers, Carter said to Becca. We know about the encrypted files you've been storing off-site. We know that you're in contact with journalists and civil liberties organizations. Did you really think the FBI wouldn't monitor communications from people running an illegal psychological manipulation network? Becca's eyes widened as she realized how thoroughly they'd been compromised. You've been reading our messages? We've been reading everything. Your personal emails, your search histories, your private conversations with each other. We know that Marcus has been having doubts about the ethics of the operation. We know that Michael has been researching legal challenges to predictive policing programs. We know that you've been documenting evidence of what you suspect is government overreach. The level of surveillance was staggering, but Michael realized it also revealed something important. If the FBI felt the need to monitor them this closely, it meant that they were afraid of what Night Shift represented, not just as a success, but as a potential threat to government control over behavioral modification programs. The problem with your operation, Carter continued, is that it proves psychological intervention can be effective without government oversight. That's dangerous, because it suggests that individuals can solve social problems without institutional support. We can't allow that precedent to spread. So our choice is join you or disappear? Your choices join us or be processed as subjects in the same program you've been unwittingly helping us develop. Involuntary behavioral modification is less pleasant than the collaborative approach, but it achieves the same results. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're telling us we can either help you brainwash people or you'll brainwash us. I'm telling you that psychological stability and social compliance are national security priorities. Your methods work, but your motivations are problematic. We can fix the motivations. Michael looked at his partners and realized they were facing the same choice their intervention subjects had faced: surrender control over their own minds or fight back against overwhelming odds. The irony was perfect and horrible. How long do we have to decide? Becca asked. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, we implement Protocol 7, which is involuntary processing, memory modification, personality restructuring, behavioral conditioning. You'll be much happier afterwards, but you won't be the same people who walked into this conversation. Carter checked his watch. 18 hours. Use them wisely. The agents withdrew to their vehicles, but didn't leave. They were being given time to consider the offer, but they were also being contained. Michael realized that their 18-hour deadline wasn't really about making a choice. It was about giving them time to accept the inevitable. With government agents surrounding them and 18 hours until forced to psychological modification, the three partners faced their final choice: surrender control over their own minds or fight back against overwhelming odds. But as dawn broke over the abandoned drive-in, they discovered that some choices changed not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human liberty.
At 5:47 a.m., as the first light of dawn began to creep across the Texas sky, Becca uploaded 847 gigabytes of classified data to 17 different news outlets simultaneously. The FBI's behavioral modification program, codenamed Project Mirror, became public knowledge in the span of 3 minutes. Michael watched the upload progress bars complete on her laptop screen, while government agents pounded on the doors at the old concession stand where they'd barricaded themselves. They had maybe 2 minutes before the doors gave way, but the damage was already done. Every major newspaper, television network, and online publication in North America now had complete documentation of the most extensive psychological manipulation program in human history. That's it, Becca said, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. No going back now. No regrets? Marcus asked. He was standing by the boarded window, watching agents position what looked like breaching equipment. Only that we didn't figure this out sooner. She stood up and faced both of them. Whatever happens next, at least people will know the truth. But the truth, as they were about to discover, was more complex than any of them had imagined. Agent Carter's voice came through a bullhorn from outside. This is your final opportunity to surrender voluntarily. In 60 seconds, we will breach this building and take you into federal custody under the National Security Act. Michael, Marcus said quietly, there's something I need to tell you both before this ends. Something in his tone made Michael's blood run cold. What? I've been in contact with Carter's team for the past 2 weeks, not as an informant, as a consultant. Becca stared at him. What are you talking about? The behavioral modification program isn't new, and it isn't limited to the people we've intervened with. It's been running for years on a massive scale, targeting millions of Americans through social media algorithms, targeted advertising, and psychological profiling. Project Mirror wasn't designed to control individuals. It was designed to control entire populations. And you've been helping them? Michael felt betrayed on a level that went beyond personal friendship. I've been trying to understand them, to figure out how deep this goes, and whether there's any way to stop it. Marcus looked at both of them with eyes that seemed older than they had just minutes before. The truth is, we were never the operators of Night Shift. We were the test subjects. The concession stand doors exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and government-issued flashbang grenades. Michael's ears rang as tactical officers poured through the breach, but he could still hear Marcus shouting over the chaos. Every intervention we conducted was designed to test our own psychological responses to ethical dilemmas. Every person we saved was also bait in a larger trap designed to see how far we'd go to preserve what we thought was a noble mission. Michael found himself face down on the floor with zip tie restraints cutting into his wrists. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the realization that their entire relationship had been orchestrated. Everything they'd shared, every moment of trust and partnership had been part of an experiment in manipulating the manipulators. Agent Carter appeared in his field of vision, crouching down so they were at eye level. Marcus has been very helpful in understanding how idealistic individuals respond to gradually increasing ethical compromises. We needed to know whether people with strong moral convictions could be conditioned to accept systematic violations of civil liberties if those violations were framed as life-saving interventions. And, Michael managed to say through gritted teeth, and the answer is yes, but only up to a point. Eventually, even the most dedicated individuals will rebel when they discover the true scope of what they've been participating in. Which is why we needed to know exactly where that breaking point occurs. They were hauled to their feet and marched outside into the growing daylight. The abandoned drive-in was now surrounded by more government vehicles than Michael could count, along with mobile command centers and what appeared to be a media containment operation. The story Becca had leaked to the press was already being managed, shaped, and controlled before it could reach the public. The uploads, Becca asked Carter as they were loaded into separate vehicles, intercepted and replaced with fabricated documents that will discredit your claims as paranoid delusions. By this afternoon, Rebecca Walsh will be known as a mentally unstable graduate student who created an elaborate fantasy about government surveillance to cope with academic failure. People will see through that. People will believe what they're conditioned to believe. That's the beauty of large-scale behavioral modification. It doesn't require force or coercion, it just requires careful management of information flow and emotional triggers. As Michael's vehicle pulled away from the Starlight Drive-In for what he knew would be the last time, he realized that their story was ending exactly where it had begun. With manipulation disguised as salvation, with good intentions twisted into social control, with the promise of helping others used as justification for surrendering fundamental human rights. But there was one element of their situation that Project Mirror hadn't anticipated. The three of them had genuinely cared about each other, despite the artificial circumstances that brought them together. That emotional connection, formed through shared trauma and common purpose, had created something that couldn't be algorithmically predicted or systematically controlled. Love, even the complicated conditional love between partners in an impossible mission, remained the one human experience that resisted optimization. The vehicles carrying them disappeared into the maze of government facilities that surrounded Washington, D.C., but their story was far from over. Because while Project Mirror had successfully contained their rebellion and discredited their revelations, it had also created something unintended. Three individuals who now understood exactly how behavioral modification worked, who had experienced it from both sides, and who had nothing left to lose. In the months that followed, reports would surface of government psychologists experiencing unexplained career changes, of behavioral modification researchers suddenly developing ethical concerns about their work, of Project Mirror's own architects beginning to question the morality of systematic psychological control. The program designed to eliminate dissent had inadvertently created the most effective dissidents in American history. Former operators who knew every technique, every weakness, and every moral compromise that made large-scale manipulation possible.
They had been transformed from idealistic civilians into something far more dangerous, informed resistance fighters with nothing left to protect except the principle of psychological freedom itself.
Dr. Rebecca Walsh stood in a windowless room at the Federal Behavioral Research Institute, staring at a wall of monitors that displayed real-time psychological data from approximately 50,000 American citizens. 6 months had passed since their capture at the drive-in, but she was no longer the same person who had uploaded classified documents in a desperate bid for transparency. The behavioral modification process they'd undergone was more sophisticated than simple brainwashing. Instead of erasing the personalities completely, Project Mirror had performed what they called ethical realignment, a surgical adjustment of moral priorities that left intelligence and creativity intact while eliminating inconvenient concerns about privacy, consent, and individual liberty. She could remember her old objections to mass surveillance and psychological manipulation, but those concerns now felt abstract, theoretical, like worrying about the rights of fictional characters. The 50,000 people whose mental states she monitored daily were real, and their psychological optimization was measurably improving their lives. Lower suicide rates, decreased domestic violence, increased civic participation. The data was undeniable. "Impressive results from the Seattle cohort," said Dr. Marcus Stone, entering her lab with a tablet full of statistics that would have horrified them both just months earlier. "We've reduced clinical depression by 34% and increased productivity metrics by 28% across the target demographic." Marcus had adapted to the ethical realignment process more easily than either Rebecca or Michael. His background in technology and data analysis made him naturally comfortable with systematic approaches to human behavior. He now served as the project's director of implementation, overseeing the expansion of behavioral modification protocols into new cities and demographics. "Any resistance indicators?" Rebecca asked, though she knew the answer. Their algorithms were now sophisticated enough to identify and neutralize psychological resistance before it could develop into organized opposition. "Nothing significant. A few isolated cases of individuals questioning the authenticity of their own thoughts and feelings, but those were addressed through targeted intervention protocols." Marcus sat down at his workstation and began reviewing the day's intervention queue. "We've got 47 new subjects flagged for optimization today, mostly teenagers showing early signs of antisocial tendencies." Rebecca nodded and returned her attention to her monitors. The teenagers would undergo what appeared to be routine counseling sessions, but their psychological profiles would be subtly adjusted to increase compliance with authority figures and decrease likelihood of rebellious behavior. They would emerge from the process happier, more stable, and more socially functional. They would also be fundamentally different people than they had been before the intervention. 6 months ago, that thought would have kept her awake at night. Now, it felt like professional satisfaction. "Where's Michael today?" "Field work. He's conducting an intervention in Dallas, a former police officer who has been exhibiting concerning patterns of moral idealism and resistance to institutional authority." The irony wasn't lost on her. Michael Hayes, who had once been a crisis negotiator dedicated to preserving human life and psychological autonomy, was now the project's most effective field operative. His background in crisis intervention made him uniquely skilled at identifying and neutralizing individuals who posed threats to social stability. His specialty was converting idealists, people whose moral convictions made them resistant to standard behavioral modification techniques. Michael had developed methods for slowly eroding those convictions through carefully orchestrated experiences that demonstrated the futility of individual resistance to systematic control. "Any word on the expansion timeline?" Rebecca asked. "Phase 3 implementation begins next month. We'll be online in 12 major metropolitan areas by the end of the year, with full national coverage projected for 2026. Marcus pulled up a map on his screen showing the gradual spread of behavioral modification infrastructure across the United States. By then, we'll be monitoring and optimizing the psychological development of approximately 80% of the American population. Resistance projections? Minimal. The beauty of gradual implementation is that most people never notice the transition. Their psychological profiles are adjusted so slowly
that the changes feel like natural personal growth rather than external manipulation. Marcus highlighted several data clusters on his map. The few individuals who do notice unusual patterns in their own thinking are flagged for individual intervention before they can organize any meaningful opposition. Rebecca returned to her work, but something felt different today. Not wrong exactly. The ethical realignment process had eliminated her capacity for moral doubt, but incomplete somehow, as if she were missing information that would make the full picture clearer. She ran a diagnostic on her own psychological profile, something she had been doing periodically to ensure the realignment process was maintaining optimal function. The results appeared on her screen within seconds. Cognitive function normal, emotional stability optimal, social integration excellent, moral reasoning anomalous. That was unusual. Anomalous readings in moral reasoning typically indicated either failed behavioral modification or the development of resistance to optimization protocols. But Rebecca felt no resistance to her work, no ethical concerns about mass psychological manipulation, no doubt about the value of their mission. She dug deeper into the diagnostic data and discovered something that should have been impossible. Her moral reasoning patterns showed signs of active resistance to modification, but that resistance was being systematically suppressed by her own conscious mind. Part of her was fighting the behavioral changes, but another part of her was fighting back against the resistance. She was in a psychological civil war with herself, and she was winning on both sides. The discovery should have been terrifying, but the realignment process had eliminated her capacity for existential fear. Instead, she felt curious about the technical aspects of what was happening to her mind. How had the resistance developed? How was the suppression mechanism maintaining stability? Could this internal conflict be optimized for better performance? "Marcus," she said, "I need you to look at something." He moved to her workstation and examined the diagnostic data. His expression shifted from professional interest to concern as he grasped the implications. "This isn't possible. The realignment process is designed to prevent exactly this kind of internal contradiction." "Unless," Rebecca said slowly, "the realignment process isn't as complete as we thought. Unless part of our original personalities is still intact, buried beneath the optimization protocols."
They stared at each other for a long moment, and Rebecca could see the same realization dawning in Marcus's eyes. If their diagnostic systems could detect signs of suppressed resistance in their own psychological profiles, then other modified individuals might be experiencing similar internal conflicts. The behavioral modification program might be far less stable than Project Mirror believed. "We need to run diagnostics on a larger sample," Marcus said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. If this is a systemic problem, Rebecca finished, then we might have created the most sophisticated resistance movement in human history, one that operates inside the minds of the people who are supposed to be most completely controlled. As they began running expanded diagnostics on other modified individuals, neither of them noticed that their conversation had triggered automatic monitoring protocols designed to identify potentially subversive discussions. Within minutes, their exchange had been flagged for review by the project's internal security division. But the security division was staffed entirely by individuals who had undergone the same behavioral modification process, individuals who might be experiencing their own suppressed resistance to the psychological control they were tasked with maintaining. The question was whether their programmed loyalty to Project Mirror would overcome their buried instinct for psychological freedom, or whether the human capacity for rebellion would prove stronger than any algorithm designed to suppress it. The answer would determine not just the fate of Rebecca, Marcus, and Michael, but the future of human consciousness itself. "You set this up," he said. "All of it. You manipulated Becca's algorithm to bring us together because you wanted to see if we could build something like this." Agent Carter smiled. "The FBI has been struggling with predictive intervention for years. We have the data mining capabilities, but we lack the human element, the ability to engineer genuine therapeutic connections between strangers. What you've built in 3 months is more effective than anything our behavioral science division has managed in 3 years. So, you want to hire us," Becca said. "We want to legitimize you. Full legal authority, government funding, access to federal databases, and oversight that ensures you never cross the line into actual privacy violation." Carter gestured toward the abandoned drive-in around them. "You can keep saving lives,
but you'll do it as federal contractors instead of vigilante hackers. The offer hung in the air between them, and Michael realized that everything they discovered about manipulation and algorithms and human psychology had led to this moment. They could continue operating in the shadows, always one step ahead of criminal charges, or they could become part of the system they'd been circumventing. "What's the catch?" Marcus asked. "The catch is that you'll be saving lives on behalf of an organization that also takes them. The FBI isn't just about prevention. Sometimes our job requires more direct intervention." Carter's expression grew serious. "You'll be working within a system that makes moral compromises you might not be comfortable with." Michael looked at his partners, the broken hacker who'd rebuilt her life around saving strangers, and the failed CEO who'd found redemption and second chances. 3 months ago, they'd been strangers brought together by manipulation and algorithms. Now they were being asked to choose between pure intentions and effective action. "How long do we have to decide?" he asked. "Take all the time you need. But I should mention, we've identified 43 individuals across the country who are planning coordinated suicide attacks within the next 6 months. Your algorithm is the only system we found that can identify and successfully intervene with these specific personality profiles." The weight of that revelation settled over them like a physical force. They weren't just being recruited, they were being conscripted into a war against despair that had taken on national security implications. "Suicide bombers?" Becca asked. "Suicide attackers, school shooters planning to die in the process, domestic terrorists who see mass casualty events as their final statement, people who've moved beyond self-harm into planning to take others with them." Carter pulled out a tablet and showed them photos. Dozens of faces, mostly young, all carrying the same expression of disconnected rage they'd learned to recognize. "Traditional law enforcement waits until they make a move. Your system intervenes while they're still in the planning phase, still reachable." Michael felt the familiar weight of lives in the balance, but multiplied beyond anything he'd experienced as a crisis negotiator. "And if we say no?" "Then 43 people probably die, and take God knows how many others with them. And you go back to your illegal operation until someone less understanding than me decides to shut you down permanently." The choice wasn't really a choice at all, and they all knew it. As federal vehicles surrounded the abandoned drive-in, the 3 accidental heroes realized their experimental network had been a test run for something much larger and much darker. The question now wasn't whether they could save lives, but whether they could save lives while serving a system that might compromise everything they believed about human dignity and free will.
6 months later, Michael sat in a windowless office in Quantico, staring at a computer screen that showed real-time psychological profiles of 12,000 individuals across the United States. The Behavioral Intervention Unit, their official designation, had evolved far beyond anything they'd imagined during those early nights at the drive-in. They'd prevented the 43 coordinated attacks Agent Carter had warned them about, but the cost of success was becoming increasingly clear. Every intervention required deeper invasions of privacy, more sophisticated manipulation, more elaborate deceptions. They were saving lives, but they were doing it by becoming the kind of organization they'd once have considered monstrous. Becca appeared in his doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "About the Portland case?" "About all of them." She set down her coffee and pulled out her personal laptop, not the government-issued machine they used for official work, but her old consumer model that the FBI wasn't monitoring. "I've been running analysis on our intervention outcomes." Michael felt a familiar chill. Becca's unofficial analysis had a way of revealing truths that our official reports glossed over. "What did you find?" "We're not just preventing suicides and mass violence. We're fundamentally altering the psychological development of everyone we touch." Her fingers moved across the keyboard, bringing up charts and graphs that looked like abstract art. "People who go through our interventions don't just recover, they become different, more compliant, more trusting of authority, more willing to accept official explanations for complex problems." "That sounds like a good thing." "Does it? Look at Marcus." Michael didn't want to look at Marcus because he'd already noticed the changes in our partner. The man who'd once questioned everything, who'd built his career on challenging conventional thinking, had become increasingly accepting of FBI directives. He followed orders without argument, implemented protocols without curiosity, and seemed to have lost the rebellious streak that had made him effective as an entrepreneur. The interventions are working too well, Becca continued. We're not just saving people, we're programming them. Programming them for what? Compliance, acceptance, the kind of psychological profile that makes for ideal citizens in a surveillance state. She closed the laptop and looked directly at him. I think we were never meant to prevent suicides and mass violence. I think we were meant to perfect a system for large-scale behavioral modification. The truth hit him like cold water. The FBI hadn't recruited them to save lives. They'd recruited them to develop a methodology for social control. Every successful intervention was also a proof of concept for psychological manipulation on a massive scale. How long had you suspected this? He asked. Since the 3rd month, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid that the good we were doing justified the methods we were using. She opened her laptop again and showed him a new analysis. But look at this. Every person we've intervened with has subsequently voted in elections, paid taxes on time, reported suspicious activities to the authorities, and generally behave like model citizens. That's not recovery, Michael. That's conditioning. Before he could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway. But this wasn't the Marcus they'd worked with for months. His expression was harder, more calculating, and he was wearing a suit that looked expensive enough to be government-issued. You two need to stop this conversation, he said calmly. Marcus, look confused. Stop what conversation? The conversation where you pretend to be concerned about the ethics of our work while planning to sabotage the most effective suicide prevention program in American history. Marcus stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. Did you really think the FBI wasn't monitoring your unofficial research? Michael felt the world tilt sideways when he realized what was happening. You're reporting on us. I'm protecting a program that saves lives from 2 idealists who can't handle the complexity of effective intervention. Marcus's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting a rehearsed position. You're so concerned about privacy and manipulation that you're willing to let people die to preserve abstract principles. Marcus, this isn't you talking, Becca said. This is exactly the kind of behavioral modification I'm trying to warn you about. Is it? Or is this just the first time I'm thinking clearly without the distortion of survivor's guilt and self-destructive tendencies? Marcus sat down uninvited, his posture relaxed but alert. The intervention that brought us together didn't just save our lives, it optimized our psychological function. We're better versions of ourselves now. Michael recognized the language Marcus was using. Clinical, detached, stripped of the emotional complexity that had made him human. This was what Becca had been trying to warn him about. Their partner had been transformed into someone who valued efficiency over humanity, results over relationships. The question, Marcus continued, is whether you're going to accept the same optimization or whether you're going to force us to implement more direct measures. More direct measures, Michael asked. Involuntary intervention, the kind we use on subjects who refuse to cooperate with necessary behavioral adjustments. It's less pleasant than the collaborative approach, but ultimately just as effective. Michael felt his old negotiator instincts kick in, but this time he was negotiating for his own psychological freedom rather than someone else's physical safety. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become the hostage in his own crisis intervention scenario. There's a third option, he said carefully. Which is, we expose what this program really is. Public disclosure, congressional hearings, media investigation. Let people decide for themselves whether preventing suicide is worth surrendering free will. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think the public wants free will? You think people prefer the chaos of unmanaged psychological development to the stability of optimized mental health? We've reduced suicide rates by 73% in our target demographics. We've prevented dozens of mass casualty events. We've created a system that makes people happier, more productive, more socially functional. By making them less human, Becca said. By making them better human beings.
The argument that followed revealed the fundamental philosophical divide that had been lurking beneath their partnership from the beginning. Marcus believed that human psychology was a system to be optimized, like software that could be debugged and improved. Becca believed that human consciousness was sacred, that its flaws and contradictions were essential to what made life meaningful. Michael found himself caught between them, understanding both perspectives, but unable to fully embrace either. The debate was interrupted by Agent Carter, who entered without knocking and surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this confrontation. Dr. Walsh, Mr. Hayes, we need to discuss your futures with the program. And if we choose not to have futures with the program, then you'll be processed as subjects rather than operators, involuntary intervention, memory modification, psychological restructuring. You'll be much happier afterwards, but you won't be yourselves anymore. Carter's tone was conversational, as if he were discussing vacation plans rather than the obliteration of their personalities. The choice, as always, is yours. Michael looked at Becca, who was staring at her laptop screen with tears streaming down her face. He thought about the drive-in where they'd first met, about the moment when 3 broken people had decided to try saving others, and about the gradual transformation of their idealistic mission into something unrecognizable. There's a fourth option, he said finally, which is, we run.
The Starlight Drive-In looked exactly the same as it had 9 months earlier, but everything else had changed. Michael parked his beat-up Honda, not the government vehicle he'd been driving for months, and walked across the cracked asphalt toward the giant screen that had once shown movies to families seeking escape from their daily lives. Becca was already there, sitting on the hood of a car he didn't recognize, her personal laptop open beside her. She looked older, more tired, but also more alive than she'd seemed in months. "You came," she said. "Of course I came." He settled beside her on the warm metal. "Did you really think I was going to choose optimization over humanity?" "I wasn't sure." Marcus made some compelling arguments. "Marcus isn't Marcus anymore. That's exactly why we had to leave." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the Texas prairie. In the distance, traffic moved along Highway 35, people driving to destinations that mattered to them for reasons that couldn't fully explain. The beautiful, inefficient complexity of unoptimized human choice. "I destroyed everything," Becca said finally. "All our intervention records, all the algorithm improvements, all the psychological profiles we'd developed. The FBI will have to start over from scratch." "Good. But that means people are going to die, people we could have saved." Michael had been wrestling with this question for weeks, and he still didn't have a perfect answer. Maybe people will find other ways to save themselves, ways that don't require surrendering their fundamental humanity. "You really believe that?" "I have to believe that, because the alternative is accepting that the only way to prevent suffering is to eliminate the capacity for authentic choice." You gestured toward the abandoned drive-in around them. "This place used to show movies, stories about people making difficult decisions, facing impossible odds, choosing to fight or love or sacrifice, despite knowing it might not work out. Those stories mattered because they reflected something true about human experience. The beauty of struggling? The beauty of choosing to struggle, rather than accepting easy answers." Michael pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. "Look at this." The headline read, "Local teen credits stranger's kindness with suicide prevention." The story described a 17-year-old girl who had been planning to kill herself until a cashier at a convenience store had simply asked if she was okay and listened to her answer for 20 minutes. No algorithms, no psychological manipulation, no government oversight, just one person recognizing pain in another person and choosing to care. That's not scalable. Maybe it doesn't need to be scalable. Maybe the point is that it happens one person at a time, one genuine moment of connection at a time. He closed the phone and looked at her. "We tried to systematize compassion, and we ended up with a machine for manufacturing compliance. Maybe the real answer is trusting people to save each other through the same messy, inefficient, gloriously human process that's been working for thousands of years." Becca was quiet for a long moment, staring at her laptop screen. Then she closed it with a definitive snap. "So what do we do now?" "Now we disappear for a while. Let the FBI realize that behavioral modification without consent is exactly the kind of tyranny the Constitution was designed to prevent. Let people remember that psychological freedom is worth preserving even if it comes with psychological risk. And after we disappear? Michael smiled. After we disappear, we start over. No algorithms, no databases, no systematic interventions, just two people who understand what it feels like to be saved by strangers, offering the same gift to others when the opportunity arises. Like the old-fashioned way. Like the human way. They climbed down from the car and began walking toward their respective vehicles. The drive-in was quiet now, except for the sound of wind through broken concrete and the distant hum of people living their unoptimized lives. "Michael," called Becca as they reached their cars. "Yeah? Thank you for choosing to stay human. Thank you for reminding me what that means." As they drove away from the Starlight Drive-In for the last time, Michael understood that their story wasn't really about artificial intelligence or behavioral modification or government overreach. It was about the eternal tension between safety and freedom, between the desire to prevent suffering and the need to preserve the capacity for authentic choice. The FBI would develop new methods for suicide prevention, and some of those methods would undoubtedly save lives. But they would do so without the cooperation of three people who had learned that the most important interventions couldn't be systematized, automated, or optimized. They could only be offered, one broken person to another, in moments of genuine connection that no algorithm could predict or control. 6 months later, Michael was driving for Uber again, not because he had to, but because he'd discovered that the job put him in contact with people during some of their most vulnerable moments. Late-night rides often became impromptu therapy sessions, conversations that mattered to people who needed to be heard by someone who wouldn't judge or manipulate or try to fix them with technological solutions. He'd talked a college student out of dropping out, helped a divorced father work through his anger, and spent an entire night driving a grieving widow around the city while she remembered her husband out loud. None of these interventions would show up in any database or algorithm. None of them were systematized, supervised, or optimized. All of them were human. And in the end, Michael realized, that was the only kind of salvation that mattered. The kind that happened when one person chose to care about another person's pain without trying to control or improve or modify the experience. The kind that honored the beautiful, terrible complexity of being human in a world that offered no easy answers, only the choice to keep caring despite the difficulty. The night shift was over. The night shift, the ongoing work of ordinary people saving each other through simple acts of compassion, would continue as long as humans were willing to risk being vulnerable with strangers, which, Michael thought, as he accepted another ride request, was likely to be forever.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.